Welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Feminist Jewish Department Store in Berlin. I'm Anita Norwich, and I'm the newly appointed academic advisor to the Center for Jewish History's Fellowship Program. CJH, as I'm sure you know, contains the archival collections of the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute. Together, these 5 partner institutions create the largest and most comprehensive archive of the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. Before we begin, a couple of technical notes. First, you're welcome and encouraged to submit questions for the Q&A portion of our program using the Q&A function that's visible on the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions at any point throughout the program, but please note that the chat function has been disabled. Secondly, the program is being recorded and will be available on the center's website and YouTube channel. We will email you the link as soon as it's available. Let me briefly introduce our speakers before I pass them the virtual mic. Angelina Palmien is a DPhil candidate in modern Jewish history at the University of Oxford. Her thesis, Producing New Women, Work and Consumer Culture in the Wilhelmine Jewish Garment Trade, examines the promotion of feminism and women's rights by companies in the Berlin industry for ready-made fashion, and they're mostly Jewish owners and executive directors from 1890 to 1914. Now a fellow at CJH, Palmien has held doctoral fellowships from the German Academic Scholarship Foundation and the Posen Society of Fellows. She's previously published on the Jewish Women's Archive site and has a peer-reviewed article in the upcoming volume entitled Jewish Dress Through Visual Sources that will be in the journal Textile, Cloth and Culture. Our respondent, Mila Ganeve, is professor of German and affiliate faculty member of the Film Studies and Jewish Studies programs at Miami University in Ohio. A graduate of the University of Chicago, she's the author of Women in Weimar Fashion, Discourses and Displays in German Culture, 1918 to 1933, and of Film and Fashion Amidst the Ruins of Berlin Between Nazism and the Cold War, 1945 to 53, as well as numerous articles on fashion history and German film. Most recently, she has published about the costumes and set designs in the popular German TV series Babylon Berlin, and she's completing an article entitled Dressing Babylon Berlin for a Global Audience, which will be forthcoming in 2022. She's also currently writing a book-length study on cabaret and film, synergy and competition in the Weimar Republic. It's my pleasure to turn this over to today's speakers.
Thank you so much, Anita, for this introduction. I hope you can all hear me well. There seems to be a problem. There seems to be a problem with the screen sharing.
We're seeing your.
Yes, but I can't move it forward the way we just tried it before the meeting. One moment, please. See if this works. Okay, now it's working. So a few years ago, I was doing research at the Archive of the German Women's Movement in Kassel in Germany, and this was back in 2017. When I was there, I came across a pair of printed albums that dated to 1913 and 1910. The covers referred to a department store, Kaufhaus in Israel. The topics were Die Frau im Jahrhundert der Energie, the woman in the century of energy, and Die Frau und ihre Welt, the woman and her world. The closer I looked at these items, the more questions they raised for me. What were publications from an apparently Jewish-owned department store doing in an archive dedicated to the history of the women's movement? As you can see from these pictures, they're rather elaborate productions. They have hardback covers. They're approximately the size of an A4, so bigger than your average book. They have fabric woven covers with gold lettering. And even just by looking at them, we can see that a substantial amount of time and resources have gone into making them. The content, however, is where it gets really puzzling. The 1910 album begins by introducing us to a range of ethnic women figures. Among them, there's this Oriental collage that you can see here, which includes a North African woman labeled as Jewish. You can see her there in the top middle wearing a hat that looks like a cone. In the center, there is a nursing Bedouin mother. And later in the article, there are several collages that are similar. For instance, then of this one of Asian women. Another picture in the same article shows an African Basuto huntswoman with a child. So it's clear that this is sort of an ethnographical segment in this album, because the next article then moves on to looking at women in occupational life. And here we see this delightful ensemble of women in unusual professions. Starting from the right, we have a woman who owns a tattoo studio in St. Petersburg. Next to her, there's a woman with a snake farm who can deliver to you every snake imaginable. The second from the left is a woman who runs a home for degenerate aristocrats, whatever that means. And other articles in the album deal with women in sports. For instance, this picture on the left depicts, quote, boxing as a women's sport, unquote. There are sections of women in the visual arts, women as mothers, as seen here in the center, women in politics. And this latter one is particularly interesting, I think. The picture on the right, one of the illustrations to the section on women in politics is a British suffragette dressed as Joan of Arc sitting on a horse. And the second album from 1913 is possibly even more cryptic. The album starts with a couple of pieces about women and the Napoleonic era. And it then goes on to focus on the evolution of women's inner being, looking at women's heart, mind, and intellect. And in one essay about the woman's soul, we're shown this multi-piece artwork, which depicts women's road from toil and drudgery into freedom. And below that, there's a photographic portrait of Ellen Key, who was a Swedish writer and pedagogue. Further along in the album, we find photographic examples of a women dress reformer and a cross-dressing female author, both here seen on the left. There are women royals, here seen dressed in military uniform. There's a picture of Helen Keller receiving her doctorate. Successful women musicians, portraits of leaders of the women's movement. There's Baroness Margaret von Reichach here in this picture, next to a deer that she's apparently bagged herself, according to the caption. And this last slide includes a portrait of Charlotte de Möhring, who was one of Germany's first female pilots. So as you can see, there is a lot going on here. And when I first saw this material, I couldn't shake off the many questions I had. What on earth is going on with this content? What is it trying to say? Is this material directed to men or to women? What's the role of these images, which you can see are so prolific and so dominant? Above all, my question was, what on earth is a department store in Imperial Berlin doing producing this material? How does it benefit them? Where are all the clothing designs or other products you might expect to see? Where are the models? Where are the advertisements? Finally, there was this obscure feminist content. How is it that a commercial company in conservative Prussia at the beginning of the 20th century is comfortable doing this, that is associating the quintessentially Jewish family name of its owners with these ideas that might frankly seem subversive to some people in this time period, or to many people, in fact? In this lecture, I can only scratch the surface of answering some of these questions, and I'll simplify by looking at two. Who were the Israels, just briefly, and what kind of business did they run? Secondly, to what extent were their publications feminist? In other words, did an Israel lend public support to women's cause through these albums, and if so, why? So let's start off with a bit of background. If you visit Berlin today, you won't find Kaufhaus and Israel. The department store complex used to stand right opposite to the Rotes Rathaus, Berlin City Hall. It covered almost the entire area surrounding Berlin's medieval historic quarters, Nikolaiviertel, and I've circled the areas here in red, as you can see. And if you've ever visited Berlin, you'll know how central this spot is from the landmarks. You can see there on the left, in particular, the Fernsehturm, the TV tower in Google Street View in this picture. The NSA department store stood there until the Second World War, when it was destroyed in Allied bombing. By that time, the store was no longer in the ownership of the Israels. They had already been forced to sell to a non-Jewish owner for a fraction of the price of the fraction of the firm's worth. And this was due to a process that the Nazis described as the Aryanization of the German economy and public life. And it is worth noting, however, that NSA was the last Jewish-owned commercial company to be operational in Berlin and to withstand Nazi persecutions. It was badly vandalized during the Kristallnacht in 1938, but it continued to operate all the way until 1939. Now, the final years of the NSA company are by now fairly well documented. Wilfried Israel was the last head of the firm for a short period after the death of his father in 1935. Wilfried personally secured the rescue of thousands of Jewish men, women, and children from Berlin and Nazi-era Europe. This was before he was killed in 1943, when his passenger plane was shot down by the German Luftwaffe over the Bay of Biscay. As you can see here on the right, two plaques commemorate Wilfried on the one hand and his heroic actions, and on the other hand, in Israel, the department store, right in the spot in Berlin where the department store used to stand on Spandauer Straße. Now, this is all a fascinating and unbelievable story, and if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend this biography written by Naomi Shepard called Wilfried Israel, a German Jewry's Secret Ambassador. And there's also an excellent documentary by Israeli filmmaker Yonatan Nir called The Essential Link. Now, for this lecture, I'd like to turn back to an earlier period. This is when Wilfried's father Berthold was in charge of the department store from the 1890s. Here's an undated picture, presumably just taken before the First World War. It's a rare picture of the entire family, including the women. On the top here, we see the daughter, Viva Israel, and her husband. Viva is getting married. On either side of Viva and her husband, we see Viva's brothers, Wilfried and Herbert. Both sons joined the company, the family firm, in the 1920s. At the bottom, we see the mother, Amy Israel, and the father, Berthold Israel, who was the director of the company. Now, Amy and Berthold were first cousins Amy was first cousins with Berthold, and Amy hailed from the British Adler family. Her grandfather and great-grandfather had been chief rabbis of the British Empire, and Amy became the second generation of her family to intermarry with the Israels, in other words. The Jewish identities of this family were an important part of their life. Because they were wealthy and cultured, they mingled with Berlin high society more broadly, but they were also prominent figures in the Berlin Jewish community, or the Gemeinde. In addition, they were active in Jewish benevolent societies. They gave generously both to Jewish and secular causes. And both Berthold and his son Wilfried actively supported Jewish settlement in Palestine in different ways. The NSA business had 1,000 people on payroll in the Imperial period, and this figure had doubled to 2,000 by the 1920s. Around a third of employees were Jewish, and we really need to remember that at most, only about 3% of the population of Berlin was Jewish in this period. So a substantial proportion of the employees, in other words, were Jewish. As a commercial institution, NSA obviously had both Jewish and non-Jewish customers, but the company ran advertising campaigns in Jewish newspapers and periodicals, for example, Ost und West. And so it's clear that they were on the hunt specifically for Jewish customers as well. In many ways, then, this company was embedded in the Berlin Jewish community. And Israel was also closely related to the rising fashion industry in Berlin. This entrepreneurial scene was established by Jewish immigrants from Germany's eastern provinces, places like Posen, in the 1830s, and it became centered around Berlin's Hausvogteiplatz Square. And Israel would enjoy a close partnership with enterprises producing and selling ready-made clothing. This connection was already established with the activities of Berthold Israel's grandfather, Nathan Israel, who founded the family firm in 1850. By the reign of Wilhelm II, that is between 1890 and 1918, Berlin was gaining a reputation as a European center for ready-made fashion, both home and abroad. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, Jewish-owned companies continued to take a leading role in the field. And so this this business community with heavy Jewish representation developed in a sector known in German as Konfektion. The Nathan Israel company was part of this picture. It first supplied fabrics to clothiers, and later it produced its own ready-made linens. In the 1890s, departments were also opened for men's, women's, and children's clothes, and gradually things like furniture were added to the inventory. And Israel helped shape how Berliners not only dressed, but decorated their homes, offices, and events for over 120 years. And all of this, as I said, was in conjunction with the development of two intersecting spheres in the German economy, where Jews were both prolific and extremely visible, namely fashion and department stores. At the peak of its success, and Israel began producing a series, or at the peak of its success in the Imperial period, let's say, and Israel began producing a series of albums. One appeared each year, 16 years in a row, between 1899 and 1914. These, as I found out, were published by the department store itself, and they were handed to customers of En Israel, apparently free of charge. Some volumes addressed topics that were quite different from the ones I showed you earlier. There's one about the German colonies, another deals with the royal household, one takes a journey around the world, and yet other albums look at technological innovations like in areas like infrastructure and aviation. If any common thread is to be found in the series, I think it is about balancing loyalties in a changing world. European society underwent immense changes right at the turn of the century, especially in economic terms, and Jews were often found right at the center of these changes. For example, new ideas in business and media came to Germany in part through Jewish international networks, and a disproportionate number of Jews was drawn to entrepreneurship, higher education, and creative professions. Many Imperial German commentators viewed this as a sort of gilded age, a time, in other words, of modernization and of progress. But for others, it was a time of uncertainty and fragmentation, and many blamed Jews for causing this apparent instability. And so there was a definite or distinct need to balance worldviews to show the positive side of how daily life was changing, and therefore, in other words, to highlight how Jews were in fact contributing to a better future. This is the context in which I think we need to understand the albums, which we'll turn to next. My objective today is to give a few examples of how these albums lend support to women's cause. And I see this a part of this broader positive engagement with a changing world. And no doubt it was also, it's also evidence of the desire on the part of the En Israel company and its owners to be found on what they perceived as the right side of history. My first examples relate to how the albums informed readers about the women's movement and in some ways even glorified it. The first album to touch on this subject is from 1907. Feminism or the women's movement are not explicitly thematized in this album, but what the album pictures and discusses closely relates to the history of the women's movement. The album is titled Upbringing in the 20th Century. It's a single author volume, and I should say that these publications only have some of them only have one author or named editor, while others are collections of essays by different authors. And these authors are generally writers, journalists, members of the upper class who are considered some kind of cultural authorities at the time. This author is Alvin Pabst, who is a male principal of a teacher training institution in Leipzig. And his text emphasizes women's innate suitability for raising and educating children. And I quote, "The real occupation of the female sex as wife and mother." This is a good example of how when we read this material in this day and age, we might think, well, that's not particularly feminist or open-minded. But if we actually look at it closer, it's much more complicated than that. The pictures are central for understanding this album in the context of feminism. And the pictures, of course, were chosen and arranged, not by individuals, but by employees, or by individual authors, but by employees working at NSL Publishing. This writer is especially concerned with gender-specific education for children, meaning handiwork for boys and domestic science for girls. But the images, as you can see, focus mostly on a very specific institution, namely Berlin's Pestalozzi-Fröbel-Haus. At the Pestalozzi-Fröbel-Haus, young women were trained for professional work in early childhood pedagogy and social work ever since 1874. But this wasn't a school that campaigned for women's right to vote or anything like that. But the founding figures of this venture had been part of the organized women's movement. And the center was among the very first in Germany to provide professional career training for women. Even the author's suggestion that women are born to be mothers wasn't anti-feminist in the way as it might seem, because the leader of the German women's movement, called Helen Lange, famously claimed that motherhood was a woman's most important career. This idea of motherhood or mothering as something that women could exercise regardless of whether they had children of their own was intrinsic to how womanhood was perceived in Imperial Berlin, and even by organized feminism. In fact, feminists like Lange and the founders of the Pestalozzi-Fröbel-Haus used this precise rhetoric of motherhood to claim that women should be given rights and responsibilities in society. Because women had unique qualities because of their sex, they should be able to contribute to society in unique ways. What should strike us at this point is how far removed this is from what the department store did or stood for in principle. There seems to be nothing here that relates to commodities, and the development of public welfare seems as far from capitalist economics as we can come. What I think we see here is NSL keeping its finger on the pulse of current affairs. More women are becoming visible in the public sphere. Women are reaching higher levels of education. For instance, the first women to take doctorates at universities of Berlin have done so only a few years back. In 1908, we also have changes in women's political rights. German women are for the first time allowed to join political parties and assemblies. Women are, in other words, becoming a reading and increasingly intellectually curious audience. In a way, then you could say that a certain chapter of German modernity is unfolding, and Israel is getting on board with this development in the same way as it supports other notions of liberal progress through its albums. The second example to illustrate how these albums educate audiences about the women's movement is found in the album from 1909. This album is titled The Leading Minds of the Present Age, Führende Geister der Gegenwart, and it is not fully focused on women or women's activities, but it is the first to thematize feminism. This album presents 10 individuals who are shaping German modernity. There are people like theater director Max Reinhardt, there is composer Richard Strauss, there's Ferdinand von Zeppelin, the inventor of airships, there is Kaiser Wilhelm II. 9 of these 10 are men. And then there's this one woman, Ellen Key. Instead of focusing on Kay, however, this author uses Kay as a sort of figurehead to symbolize the entire women's movement, especially the German one. And I quote, everything in the women's world today, which calls, sometimes even cries, for social and political liberation from the shackles of old prejudices. All efforts to achieve indiscriminate equality between the sexes with regard to professional life and the academic or technical and practical education for it, but especially efforts to radically reform secondary and elementary school education, as well as change the social attitudes concerning the unconstricted right of the female section of the population to satisfy their need for love. All of these demands, longings, and desires look confidently towards the spirited, witty, and eloquent Swede. You'll notice that this language is quite evocative, with words like liberation, shackles, prejudice, equality. This particular author, who happens to be male, is both interested in and sympathetic toward the women's movement. Women, as I mentioned, get only one chapter in this album. Its main focus is on surveying these cultural and intellectual greats of contemporary German culture. There is nonetheless a sense that the women's movement is a moment in German history that is to be celebrated and a beginning of a better future. So similar to the previous example I showed, there's both a strong educational aspect and a celebratory feel to how it's presented. This particular author, who is an academic scholar by profession, also specifically characterizes Ellen Key as a cultural reformer. And now some of you may be familiar with this idea of Kultur from German history, but it's connected to, I guess, these metaphysical ideas of elevating humanity, of causing humans to evolve into higher cultivated beings. And this is a language that is similar to what you sometimes see used by members of the women's movement about their goals and activities. So there is a sense of trying to both legitimize and demonstrate the dignity of women's cause, and also its worth, not just for women themselves, but for society as a whole. Then if we turn to the illustrations for this essay, we notice a very, very interesting development. There is indeed one portrait of Ellen Key, which you can already see here. But then there's also, first of all, a collage of German feminists that you see here on the left. And second, a picture of British suffragettes campaigning for the vote, even though there's nothing in the text about suffrage, the women's suffrage, or about British feminism. This is not the only instance in which the albums bring in these British illustrations. In the album from 1910, for instance, we have these pictures of British suffragettes as examples of women in politics that you see here on the left. In these illustrations, the captions tell us that these are Mrs. Pankhurst arrested and Mrs. Pankhurst in prison clothes. And these are, of course, the famous mother and daughter, Christabel and Emmeline Pankhurst. They were part of a family who were centrally involved in the English women's movement. They were arrested several times in the 2 years before the publication of this album, and later for acts like arson. So the approach of the Pankhursts was markedly different from what you saw in the album about upbringing from 1907 that I showed you. In that example, German women in professional childcare were very much accepting of many of the gender norms of the time, of expectations of women's role in society, and they framed their cause within these norms, trying to gain influence for women without shaking the status quo too much. And yet, in 1909 and 1910, we have N. Israel presenting these two feminist approaches alongside one another as if they were one and the same thing. What we notice then is that N. Israel is adding its own touch. The albums are mainly focused on Germany, but through incorporating these images from all around Europe and beyond, they highlight the international dimensions of feminism. Through the illustrations, they also demonstrate the force of the women's movement as something not confined to one country, but something that's simultaneously happening across borders. Now, this occurrence of British suffragettes is striking. These events obviously gained a lot of publicity and generated discussion in Germany. but this wasn't always in a favorable tone. Middle-class feminists, middle-class German feminists were strongly reluctant to endorse militarism and these sort of confrontational strategies that were used by some suffragettes. And so it's a bit odd that suffragettes are shown in this idealized manner. And it may well be explained by the fact that the Israels were half British. In fact, Amy Israel was apparently one of a small number of women who sometimes wore trousers in Berlin at this time. And this was something that even few German feminists did. While on the other hand, these bloomers trousers were something that people automatically associated with English-speaking feminists. It's hard to escape the sense that NSL is condoning or even justifying the activities of the suffragettes through these graphic choices made in the albums. And the methods of suffragettes are in no way criticized. The reader is then left with the impression that the principles of women's liberation were the same, regardless of these different approaches presented by feminists in different countries. The second way in which the NSL albums lend support to women's cause, apart from what I mentioned, educating readers about feminists and apparently even casting them in a positive light, is that they have a tendency to idealize the new woman. Now, the new woman was a sort of female ideal type that emerged in European literature in the 19th century. She represented a woman who was achieving new levels of personal autonomy. And in this way, she was defying societal expectations, be it through pursuing a career or education or other activities that weren't usually attributed to women. There was particular visual imagery that went along with new womanhood. She was often depicted riding a bicycle as a symbol of the freedom of the modern woman. Trousers and reformed dress were often important visual markers. This idea of leaving behind the corset. Though I do have to emphasize that pants are extremely rare and a short-lived fashion precisely around the 1910s. The figure of the new woman was sometimes valorized and other times satirized, like you see here on the right. Satirized, it's this sort of man-woman, Mann vibe in German, as someone who goes against nature by trying to be too much like the opposite sex. And you can relate this to things like Freud's concept of penis envy, which he introduced in 1908. So at a very similar point in time. The new woman, or die neue Frau, was not a term used widely in Germany until the 1920s. But she was an image that inhabited people's imagination through this growing public sphere of newspapers, literature, and other media. In Germany, she provoked anxieties about the breakdown of the institution of the family, and also about fertility rates, because women were having fewer children. And still, despite these widespread anxieties, new women were still sort of mythical creatures. In some sense, they only seemed to mostly exist in fiction and satirical drawings. Perhaps the most striking feature for me of the NSL albums is how they picture new women in the flesh. These are photographic images, which is significant because even more than today, people in the early 20th century had a strong sense that the photograph showed something real, that it was a physical trace of reality that was mechanically produced. It was only in the late 19th century that people had figured out how to transfer and duplicate photographs in a cost-efficient way. And this process was known as half-tone. So suddenly there was an act of seeing and witnessing that wasn't there a few decades earlier. And in this case, it was a matter of seeing and witnessing how women all around the West were making inroads into so-called male domains. In the 1909 album that features Ellen Kay, this is particularly striking, as you see here in these pictures. You have Marie Curie in her laboratory on the center right. Next to her, the center left, there's Gertrud von Petzold, a German woman who was the first female church minister in the United Kingdom. On the left, we see women carpenters, women workers at a print shop. And on the right, there are these wonderful portraits that include a professional female diver and an apprentice painter. What's interesting is how these new women figures are used as illustrations for texts about the women's movement. This happens especially in this piece about Ellen Key, from where I've selected these images. Now, this text says nothing about women's professional work, and yet In Israel chooses to feature these real-life new women who may or may not be feminists themselves as illustrations that feminism is progressing, and society is progressing with it. Why is this? What is the function of the new woman in this context? I mentioned earlier that Imperial Germans had complicated feelings about the new woman and what she represented. However, the new woman was also a figure with certain marketing value. The German economy was growing, and with it, the purchasing power of middle-class women. With the rise of ready-made fashion, the new woman signified new ways of presenting in public. It promoted a sort of aspirational role model who, at least in some iterations, would be identifiable based on how she dressed. On a more abstract level, she was the embodiment of the modern culture that establishments like department stores represented. Modern consumer culture was all about fulfilling desires and less about supplying the things that people actually needed in order to live. In modern consumer culture, the female consumer was also an important player. In Israel was among a number of department stores in this period that described itself as a women's paradise in one of the very first albums from 1901. This term is usually attributed to Émile Zola's department store novel Lady's Paradise from 1883. The women's paradise of the department store was supposed to be a magical place where women could fill their heart's desires through making purchases, but it was also a space where they could feel empowered as consumers, making decisions about how to spend money, making creative decisions about the home, about dressing their children, etc. The fact that En Israel became increasingly interested in engaging with women's issues in print, I think conveys a recognition that women are a valuable audience to reach out to from a commercial point of view. This visual idealization of new womanhood can be detected from 1906 until the very last issue in 1914. One of the earliest examples is the presentation of the dance school of the American Isadora Duncan from 1906 in a volume about the theater that you see here. Duncan is a good example of how this new or modern new woman ideal intersected with commercial interests for companies like En Israel. Apart from having pursued a successful career as a professional dancer and modernizer of choreography, Duncan was also one of the biggest style icons of the early 20th century. She symbolized and she brought into fashion new dress ideals that were tied to the liberation of women from shapewear. Duncan chose instead this sort of Grecian style that allowed her body to move and controversially even reveal some bare skin. And she also professionally collaborated with prominent fashion designers like Paul Poiret, who were known for reforming female fashion. If we then turn to other albums, such as the ones from 1910 and 1913, we're met with a host of other female celebrities, many of them French, like those pictured here on the right. These were archetypal new women emerging in the field of entertainment, who were really some of the first celebrities and fashion inspirations. And the reason why this was possible is because their photographic portraits could now spread far and wide in the illustrated press and publications like the NSL albums. So conservative, particularly male commentators, may have promoted certain ideas about what was appropriate for women or female ideals. And German feminists may have been conservative, which they were, in how they presented themselves, because they wanted, usually to keep people's focus on more important matters. But people's private patterns of consumption were another matter. I don't think it's possible to determine a sort of clear cause and effect between the choice of promoting the new woman and how En Israel fared as a business. But I do think it would be an understatement to say they were ahead of their time. I think that the fact that the company associated its brand with women's modernity at such an early stage probably partly paved the way to their enormous success in the 1920s, when, in the 1920s was when consumer culture really exploded, and this phenomenon of the new woman became a true cultural icon in Germany. Finally, there was the way in which NSA connected the ideal of the new woman to its employees. Several albums after 1910 include almanacs with these sort of behind the scenes pictures of Israel workers. The 1914 album is titled Work and Leisure, and here we find these photographic gems from the facilities of Israel, showing women sewing ready-made linens in the department store's workshops. Others are typing correspondence. On the top right, there's an image that's captioned the Bank of Independent Women, which was the bank that was that was part of the NSL company. And below, there are also women operators at the telephone switchboard. These women are used here to promote Israel as an incubator of productivity and a civilized modern way of living. As several albums informed readers, the firm offered its employees courses in language, literature, and hygiene. And employees could take part in exercise classes and sports teams. The company had its own boathouse, and there was an in-house doctor to name. These are just a few of the perks mentioned for those working in the store. Throughout the Wilhelmine period, Israel was, by its own estimation, advancing Kultur, that is culture and civilization, through cultivating its male and female employees. The Israels had voluntarily set up pension and sick funds in the 19th century, and these commitments to social justice and philanthropy were explicitly linked to their identities as Jews. Company benefit schemes offered workers generous coverage by the standards of the time. Later in 1925, Israel founded its own commercial training school that was unique as a private commercial institution with exams recognized by the state. Both men and women received vocational training at this school, though we should note that in line with practice at the time, the type of programs available were different depending on whether you're a man or a woman. So to conclude, was Israel a Jewish feminist department store in Imperial Berlin? What makes a feminist department store? Can a department store even be feminist? If it is feminist or was feminist, was there anything intrinsically Jewish about it being feminist? The answer to the latter question is, of course, no, but I do think it is significant that we're dealing here with a company of a family who are proudly Jewish in public, while also trying to figure out the best way to navigate their business in a sometimes hostile landscape. Both of these considerations were central to their decision-making processes. In this talk, I focused on the printed materials, giving examples of how the Israel firm disseminated feminist ideas in print. As far as I'm aware, these albums are pretty unique. There were parallels in the Berlin Illustrated Press that took, a visual interest in the new woman as a figure, but these were rarely accompanied with overt verbal expressions of support for the activities of the women's movement. Similarly, publications by the organized women's movement didn't generally pursue this kind of visual discourse to underline their arguments. And Israel therefore created an exceptional series of artifacts. They add an extremely interesting perspective to the historical study of feminism and its intersections with Jewish and German economic history. It now makes perfect sense to me that these albums should be included not only in albums that preserve Jewish history, but in places like the German Archive for the Women's Movement, where I first encountered them 5 years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angelina. We turn now to Mila Ganeva.
Hello, everyone. I was trying to start the video. All right, here we go. Thank you, Angelina, for an illuminating presentation. I enjoyed reading it beforehand and enjoyed it even more listening to it now. And I'll keep my comments fairly short to give the audience also a chance to ask questions and for you to address some of the questions. The talk that we just heard is a fascinating addition to literature of proliferating literature, body of literature on the Jewish department store in Germany and its very special relationship to the modern or the new woman. And I would allow myself to suggest some titles that came out recently and deal with the department store, just to give you a sense of the context in which the presentation we heard is really breaking new ground. In his study on the Jewish department store Jewish department store, historian Paul Lerner investigates the multiple discourses and even fictional narratives surrounding the department stores. And he also sheds light on the attributes toward women as consumers, but as well as employees. And there has been also plenty of other work on the department store as a physical space, on its architecture, its interiors, its display windows and decorations, the fashion shows it's putting on. And here comes Angelina Palman's contribution to that landscape of scholarly investigations. And she focuses on the Jewish department store in a truly innovative way. She brings in a sharp focus on the publications of the department store, something that no one has ever looked at, probably because no one has ever come across those publications. And by publications of a department store, I mean albums, calendars, catalogs, illustrated magazines, and the ways in which these publications enter a wider public debate about modern women's issues. And these publications, as we heard in the talk, presented an idiosyncratic combination of text and images. And the images were both photographs and collages and other illustrations. And both channels for communicating a position on women's issues seems to be very important. The questions are important, but also that we just heard raised in Angelina's presentations. They're important, but also incredibly difficult to answer. One question is, to what extent are these albums a significant intervention into the so-called women's public sphere around 900? We should keep in mind that the rise of the department store coincided with the rise of another set of Jewish-owned institutions, such as the publishing houses like Mose publishing house in Berlin, and also Ullstein. Those publishing houses also produced a large body of diverse materials aimed at same audience, German middle class, educated women's audience. So the question for future investigation is, to what extent is there collaboration or competition between department stores and publishing houses in reaching those audiences? Angelina also raises the interesting question about authorship and of those texts and also of the photographs, and and the audience and the readers. What can we find out more about that relationship? And a third point that I would like to raise in that connection is the comparative point. Was the department store in Israel a unique one? And we know that there were other major department stores that experienced similar rise in economic influence in Germany in that imperial period. I'm talking about Gerson, Rudolf Herzog, Wertheim, Tietz. Did they pursue a similar agenda? Did they make a similar foray in the publishing business? Did they do this out of embracing similar public position vis-a-vis women's rights, the position of the middle-class woman in society, or did they do this out of as a competing with their rivals in the fashion industry? And what were the international connections? We see the images that we see in published in the albums obviously come from other countries. The photographs are made and distributed by foreign photographic agencies. What were the international connections of the department stores, and what impact that had on the women's issue? These are a lot of questions that are cannot be given a definitive answer, but would be a good starting point for a discussion. Thank you all, once again.
Thank you very much for those comments. Angelina, there are a bunch of questions.
Oh, I lost you. Can't hear you, Anita.
My apologies. Mila raised some fascinating questions, and there are others that are on our chat, on the Q&A rather. Do you want to respond, or shall I add on to the questions some other questions?
Let's start with Mila's. Yeah, I mean, I won't be able to answer all of them, but I'll select a few. Thank you so much for this. These excellent comments and perspectives, which I really appreciate. And so first of all, in terms of what you mentioned about these albums not being dealt with before in academia or investigated, they have been mentioned in a couple of publications, and I have to give due credit to Paul Lerner, for example, who does mention them in a few sentences, or a few paragraphs in his book that you mentioned, but they haven't been sort of really studied in depth, and I haven't come across another sort of parallel investigation focusing on another department store. So in that sense, absolutely, this is a very unique or interesting case study in that sense. In terms of participating in this women's public sphere that you mentioned, I think you're absolutely right that there are other, in some ways, rivaling publications out there. There are women's magazines that are proliferating in this period, and journals both in Germany and around Europe. And there are some parallels, as I mentioned in the presentation as well. But I think sort of what stands out to be about these is the combination of a commercial institution doing it and the type of visual material that we're seeing, and this combination of what seems to be an endorsement of the activities of the women's movement. And that combination I haven't seen elsewhere. So you mentioned Gerson and Herzog, for example. They produced albums, but the format was different. And, these albums, if you look at albums that were produced by department stores in the US, for example, they have promotional material about the department store. But to my knowledge, there isn't a sort of a similar type of publication where they go into these philosophical and political realms, discussing things that aren't sort of directly related to the everyday life of the department store. So that's sort of what really I think is very interesting about these. International connections of the department stores. I think you're right, that's really important when you look at the pictures in particular, that these pictures are coming from a variety of locations, and that's sort of shaping how this end product comes together. And we don't know where the pictures are coming from because they don't mention in the albums. There's no image credits. So I've, had to do a lot of detective work to figure out, I've found some of them, being able to trace, probable geographical origins, and maybe in some cases even like the image banks that they got them from originally. But yeah, I think it's influenced what it looks like in terms of this visual layout and this experimental design and everything that goes with it. I think I'll leave it there for now, and let's see if there are any other questions.
If I can just add one sentence to that international perspective, this is coming from me, not from one of the questions, but I was struck in the album covers for 1905 and 1908, taking over the world, right? I mean, one is called Weltreise, the world trip, world travel, and the other one is above and beneath the earth, and they're holding globes. I'm not quite sure what to make of that internationalist perspective there, but I think it's worth at least noting. There are also a number of, let me start with the questions that are perhaps yes/no questions that can be answered quickly. Were the authors of these albums primarily Jewish or not?
So, yeah, I can answer that question first. There was a mix. It's sometimes, impossible to tell whether they were Jewish or not based on the kind of biographical information we have available to this day. But my impression is that the majority are not Jewish. And the same goes with the images as well. I showed you one depiction of Jewish women, and there are comparatively few pictures of Jews in these albums. So that's another interesting aspect. So yeah, there are Jewish authors, but most of them aren't, at least they're not sort of known as Jewish figures in the public sphere, but rather in other areas.
And were the writers men or women primarily?
Well, that's another interesting aspect, especially when we think about these women-themed albums. The one from 1910, which is the first one I came across, it has majority female authors, which is very interesting, and also something that seems very progressive. But then you have other albums that focus on women's issues. For example, the one from 1913, where there are majority male authors, and that's the case for most of the albums that mention or picture women, that the majority are male, which is sort of what you would expect, I think. So, so yeah, for me, kind of this 1910 one stands out actually as an exception, that there are mostly women writers there.
There's a question that asks if the store also published more standard catalogs, that is, catalogs with merchandise in them.
Yeah, and those absolutely. Now, those were separate publications, which, when you flick through these albums at the back, you'll have the odd sort of type of advertising material there, but very, very little. But sometimes they'll say you can order our catalog for free, and stuff like that. So we know that they existed. Obviously, not a huge amount of them have survived, but there were these sort of priced catalogs that, prices, catalogs with merchandise, with prices and things like that you don't see at all in these albums. So they're completely sort of separate from this typically commercial material that also, came from the same publishing house that was in the department store itself.
There are two questions that I think are related, so let me read them both at once. Women from the elevated classes would be the major buyers and consumers at the department store. Were they therefore, hence, were they more receptive to feminism as a result of this consumer culture? And another question, did they promote the new woman because they saw this figure as potentially having a larger amount of disposable income earned by the women themselves and greater control over how they spent it. Was the motive here commercial and economic? And a comment from the same person: in Britain and America, the new woman was considered undomestic, thus less likely to be concerned with caring for others and more with caring for herself. The questions are about the consumer culture.
Yeah, I'm trying to see the question written down here, which is very helpful to have this in the chat. So I think this is a very interesting question and an interesting perspective. I think, having sort of wrestled with these albums for a while, I think there's a mix of motives here. You know, I think part of it, which I tried to highlight in the presentation as well, I think part of it is commercial, but also considering this very odd quality of the material. It's not, you know, the amount of time and resources that they put into this, it's not entirely clear what the sort of payoff would be in all cases. So I think it's not always clear that it's commercially motivated entirely, which makes me question, you know, what are the ideological ideas that are sort of underneath this. And of course, we don't have that much biographical information as we'd like about this family, particularly from this period, which would be interesting to know more about that.
Were the stores open? Was the store open for business? Well, one question asks if the stores were open for business, if the store was open for business on Saturdays and Jewish holidays. And one might add Sunday probably would be an easier answer.
Yeah. So I think, you know, stores would have been closed on Sundays because they were in Germany. But the interesting thing with pretty much one of the things which sort of shows quite clearly the number or the prevalence or the prominence or whatever word you want to use of Jewish entrepreneurs in this field is that among department stores and ready-to-wear clothing companies and retailers, most of them are closed for Jewish high holidays in the Wilhelmine period. And then as for in Israel, they were also closed on the Sabbath until 1907, when a sort of clause was invoked that had been set out in the will of the previous generation of owners that said, you know, if you need for reasons of competition to stay open, then it's okay, basically, as long as you compensate by you know, philanthropic means, by giving to good causes and that sort of thing. So yes, they were open on the Sabbath from 1907, but from 1815 until 1907, they were closed on the Sabbath, so for a lot of years.
Okay. In terms of those who worked in the store and those who shopped in the store, I'm again combining a couple of questions. Is there any way to know the demographics of those? That is, were the employees more women than men, more Jews than non-Jews? Were the consumers, what did they sell for men? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I mean, what we know is what kind of departments they had. We don't really know, you know, because the store and everything, you know, all their records were so systematically demolished, you know, during the Nazi era. It's very typical, you know, that we know very little of these kind of enterprises. It's very sad, you know, but the Center for Jewish History, the Leo Baeck Institute, has an online digitized archival collection for the family. And there are some, you know, there's some information we can gain from there. In terms of the demographic, the workforce, my understanding, this is based on health insurance figures of the employees covered by health insurance, which were published in statistical yearbooks in Berlin. About half and half were women and men worked at the Israel store during the First World War. So this was actually somewhat less than you have at the other, somewhat less women than you have at the other big department stores like Wertheim, which had a larger proportion of women, which again, I don't really know why that is, but it's a very interesting detail, especially since they take such a public sort of, they're so proud of their women workers, you know, in their printed materials.
Is there some way to discern any kind of political motivation behind the albums and their contents?
yeah, I mean, I think there are, it depends on what you mean by political, doesn't it? I think they're very political in many ways, but you have a variety of a mix of themes that, are patriotic, and you have some which deal with imperial themes, and obviously those are, imperialism, colonies, obviously those are very political in many ways. But you see this shift that many of the earlier albums deal with those kind of themes, and then they move more into this sort of what Mila was mentioning, this women's public sphere, and also this feminist public sphere, which is a sort of a different, or a slightly related one, but a different sphere, if you will. So there is sort of a change in how they're, what kind of political themes they're engaging with, which, yeah, it's fascinating.
Right. I'm afraid we've gone over our time, and we're certainly out of time, but if either of you would like to have the last word, I'm happy to give you another minute or so to do that. Mila, please.
Well, that's really not the last word.
Definitely
in such a research that Angelina is undertaking, and but just also it strikes me too, the question of class cannot. You asked about are they political? They're not. It seems to me they're not political in an overt way, but they're political in a very roundabout way, because they are addressing and at the same time cultivating a specific class of women or of readers that in a certain way mirrors the class of Jews who created the department stores. They are upper middle class bourgeois, definitely not religious or assimilated. They are very ambitious to travel, to get educated, to know the world. And it will be interesting to read, as you are already doing it, to read these albums as a mirror of the aspirations of the creators of the department stores. Most likely they have the international connections, they travel, they've traveled or travel to collect those images or those stories that are then published into the albums. But in a way, they also serve as an inspiration to their readers to also take on such adventures in the future. It's also very limited in that way, very limited female public sphere, because it excludes a large segments of the society at that time too. Thank you. That was a comment, and inspired again by the discussion we had.
Thank you.
Can I just briefly say, yeah, I think the question of class is really crucial, and I would have loved to have been able to go into that more in the presentation. But you have pictures of working class women that are deployed in this sort of weird fantasy of the middle class feminist, if you will, that's being sort of painted here, and that's something that I discuss or will discuss in my thesis, and I think it's really interesting how those working class women are drawn into that picture, and particularly how there's sort of an absence of an engagement with the idea that department stores and ready-made fashion industries are employing a lot of working class women, many of whom are working in really terrible conditions. And so again, there's this sort of idealized view that sort of, there's this massive elephant in the room that's not ever being addressed. So yeah, that's also another really interesting point. And to Anita, you were asking about the globes and internationalism, and I warmly recommend Paul Lerner's book there. He actually discusses those exact things, especially related to NSL and companies in Berlin on those themes. So you'll get all the answers from there.
Thank you. If we were in person, I would ask you to join me in thanking Angelina Palmian and Mila Ganeve. And we're not in person, but nonetheless, I want to thank them on behalf of everyone who's on this webinar and who will be listening to it. It's a very interesting conversation. I urge our listeners to check with CJH website. There will be other talks from other fellows at CJH that will be coming forth in the next few weeks. And I thank you all for joining us, and I especially thank our two speakers for sharing their knowledge with us.